The photograph arrived without ceremony, tucked inside a plain archival envelope, its edges worn soft by time. At first glance, it was exactly what one would expect from a family portrait taken in 1904, formal, restrained, almost lifeless. The parents sat rigidly, their expressions carved from patience and obligation, the kind worn by people who had been told not to move no matter what they felt. The room they occupied was bare, the backdrop painted to suggest elegance it didn't truly possess. Most people would have passed over it without pause. But there was something unsettling about how calm it all seemed. The longer the image was studied, the more that calm began to feel staged, like silence held too carefully. The daughter stood as expected, eyes unfocused, posture obedient. The father's gaze drifted slightly past the camera, as though distracted by a sound no one else could hear. The mother's lips were pressed together tightly, not in discomfort, but in restraint, as if she were holding back words best left unsaid. And then there was the child. He stood just off-center, close enough to the father to touch him, yet never quite doing so. His face was sharper than the others, not blurred by time or long exposure. His eyes were dark and alert, fixed directly on the viewer with an intensity that felt wrong for the era, wrong for a child, wrong for a moment that was supposed to be dead and finished. The longer one stared, the harder it became to look away. There was no innocence in his expression. No stiffness. Instead, there was awareness, an unmistakable sense that the boy knew he was being watched, even now, more than a century later. His mouth curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something closer to recognition. As if he had been waiting, the first sign that something was wrong came not as fear, but as professional irritation. The appraiser had seen every flaw time could inflict on early photographs: chemical streaking, warped emulsion, uneven exposure, ghosting caused by subjects who failed to remain still. Images from 1904 were especially unforgiving, their long exposure times demanding patience from anyone unfortunate enough to be placed before the lens. Children, in particular, rarely cooperated. They blurred, they smudged, their faces softened into indistinct shapes as they shifted under the strain of stillness. This knowledge was instinctive, ingrained after years of study, and it was precisely why the child in the portrait caused such unease. The photograph was technically correct in every other respect. The lighting was harsh but controlled, the shadows deep and predictable. The parents' faces bore the faint softness of minute movement, not enough to ruin the image, but enough to mark it as genuine. Even the daughter showed the telltale signs of fatigue in her eyes, the kind that came from holding a fixed expression too long. But the boy did not share those imperfections. His face was sharp in a way that defied the camera's limitations, every contour clean, every line intentional. It was not merely that he appeared clearer than the others, it was that he appeared present. Early photographic clarity had a ceiling, a natural boundary enforced by glass plates, chemicals, and time itself. No subject could surpass it. Yet the boy's features seemed to push past that boundary, as if the photograph had prioritized him, sacrificing realism elsewhere to preserve his detail. His eyes were not dulled by the exposure, they were alert, reflective, catching light in a manner closer to modern photography than anything from the turn of the century. They held depth, not the flat darkness typical of the era, but layers, as though something behind them was watching back. At first, the appraiser considered retouching. Some photographers of the period enhanced faces with pencil or ink, sharpening eyes or smoothing skin to satisfy clients. But those alterations left traces, unnatural edges, inconsistencies in grain, interruptions in the chemical flow of the image. Under magnification, the boy's face revealed none of these. The grain was consistent, the texture seamless. There was no sign of interference, no evidence of a hand guiding the image after it was taken. The clarity was native, born at the moment of exposure. What troubled the appraiser most was not the sharpness, but the expression it preserved. Children in 1904 did not look like this. They did not meet the camera with recognition. Photography was still a strange, mildly threatening process, and most subjects reacted with confusion or discomfort. This boy showed neither. His gaze was direct, focused, deliberate. It was the look of someone who understood what the camera was doing and why it mattered. Worse still, his expression did not belong to a single moment. It felt sustained, as if it extended beyond the fraction of time the shutter remained open. The appraiser measured proportions, comparing the boy's facial symmetry to known standards from the era. Nothing was distorted. Nothing was exaggerated. And yet the face seemed too composed, too intentional. The faint curve of his mouth suggested amusement, but restrained, controlled. It was not the accidental hint of a smile caught mid-breath. It was placed there, held there, as though he had chosen it in advance. That alone should have been impossible. Holding an expression for the length required by early cameras demanded effort even from adults trained for such sittings. For a child, it was nearly unthinkable. The technical impossibility began to compound. The boy's pupils reflected a shape that did not correspond to studio equipment of the time. The light source was wrong, too narrow, too vertical. It suggested a present standing where no one should have been, positioned with purpose rather than necessity. Yet the parents' eyes reflected nothing unusual, only the dull glare of lamps. The inconsistency implied selectivity, as if the boy alone was responding to something unseen by the others. There was also the matter of motion. Long exposures punished movement, stretching it into blur. Even breathing too deeply could soften an image. But the boy's collar lay perfectly flat, his hair unmoved, his posture unnaturally steady. Not rigid, not tense, simply settled. It was the stillness of someone comfortable remaining exactly where they were. This was not the stillness of obedience, but of belonging. As the appraiser continued to examine the photograph, a subtle realization took hold. The boy did not feel captured. The others did. The parents and daughter seemed trapped by the moment, pinned to the paper by circumstance and expectation. The boy, however, felt anchored. He did not look like someone caught unaware by history. He looked like someone placed intentionally within it. The longer the image was studied, the more the sense of chronological dissonance grew. The boy's face carried a familiarity that did not align with 1904. It echoed expressions seen in much later photographs, self-aware, knowing, faintly ironic. It was the face of someone who understood being observed and had long since made peace with it. This awareness was the true violation, more unsettling than any technical flaw. Cameras of that era recorded appearances, not consciousness. They documented surfaces, not intent. And yet intent radiated from the boy's gaze. The appraiser attempted to rationalize it, to reduce the unease to overexposure of imagination. But every attempt circled back to the same conclusion: the boy's face had not merely been photographed. It had participated. It had engaged with the act itself, meeting the lens not as an object, but as a counterpart, aware of the transaction taking place. The camera had not taken something from him. If anything, it felt as though he had allowed the camera to take the others, while he remained untouched, watching patiently from within the frame, waiting for the next person who would lean in close enough to notice that his eyes were never meant to be still at all. Their unease deepened when the appraiser moved from the photograph itself to the records meant to explain it. Every image, no matter how strange, belonged to a chain of documentation: names, dates, places, births, deaths. Photographs lied less than people, but paperwork rarely lied at all. At least, that was the belief. The envelope identified the family as respectable, well documented, and rooted firmly in the region. There should have been no mystery waiting in the archives. Yet from the moment the names were entered into the database, absence began to speak louder than fact. The parents were easy to trace. Property deeds, church registries, tax rolls, all aligned neatly. Their marriage was recorded, their residence confirmed, their social standing reinforced through mentions in local papers. The daughter appeared as expected, her name recurring across school rosters and census reports. But when the appraiser searched for the boy, the system returned nothing. Not a delay. Not an incomplete entry. Nothing at all. As if the name had never existed long enough to be written down. At first, this seemed like a clerical oversight. Child mortality was high in the early 1900s, and many infants died before formal registration. But the boy in the photograph was not an infant. He was old enough to stand, old enough to hold himself with confidence, old enough to have left some trace of his brief existence. Even children who died young were recorded in some way: burial records, family Bibles, handwritten notes in the margins of census forms. The silence surrounding this child was too complete. The appraiser widened the search, combing through alternate spellings, nicknames, misfiled surnames. He searched forward and backward in time, looking for a birth before the photograph or a death shortly after. Still nothing. It was as though the child had stepped into the photograph fully formed and then dissolved the moment the shutter closed. This absence was not random. It was deliberate in its completeness, a void shaped exactly like a person who should have been there. Local newspapers provided no comfort. Announcements of births, illnesses, and funerals filled their pages, often with painful detail. The family appeared several times: charity events, church gatherings, seasonal travel, but never with mention of a second child. Group descriptions listed the parents and daughter alone, even in years before and after the photograph was taken. It was as if the boy had been present for a single instant and erased from every other moment surrounding it. The most troubling discovery came from the family's private correspondence. Letters between relatives referenced the household often, discussing finances, health, and social obligations. The tone was warm, familiar, and candid. Children were mentioned, worries expressed, futures planned. Yet always in the singular. The daughter was discussed repeatedly, her education and disposition a recurring topic. There was no coded language, no euphemism, no grieving pause that might suggest a loss too painful to name. The boy simply did not exist in the language of those who should have known him best. As the appraiser followed the trail forward in time, a pattern emerged that felt increasingly intentional. Every major tragedy linked to the family occurred after the photograph was taken. A sudden illness claimed the mother within a few years. The father's financial ruin followed shortly after, marked by a series of decisions that made little sense in context. The daughter disappeared from records altogether in early adulthood, neither married nor buried in the region. Each event stood alone on paper, yet together they formed a quiet collapse, the kind history rarely dramatizes. What unsettled the appraiser was not the tragedies themselves, but their timing. The photograph predated all of them. It stood at the threshold, a calm moment before the unraveling began. And within that moment stood a child who officially never lived. The record suggested a family of 3 moving toward misfortune, while the image insisted there had been 4, if only briefly. This contradiction created a fracture between evidence and memory, one that refused to close. Attempts to dismiss the boy as a studio prop or retouched addition failed quickly. Studios kept meticulous logs of sittings, props, and retouching requests. The archive held the studio's ledger from that year. The family's appointment was recorded clearly, noting the number of subjects present. The entry listed 4. Not 3. 4. No names were attached to the count, but the number itself was undeniable, scrawled in the same hand as dozens of other confirmed sessions. That single numeral changed everything. It meant the boy had not been added later, nor imagined by a careless viewer. He had stood there in the studio, counted by the photographer, framed intentionally within the composition. And yet every personal and public record denied his existence beyond that room. The appraiser began to understand that the photograph was not merely an anomaly, it was the only place where the truth had survived intact. Further investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Other families connected socially or geographically to the Whitmores experienced similar patterns. A photograph taken shortly before a sudden misfortune. A child present in the image who vanished from records. Always the same age range. Always the same composed expression. The records did not deny tragedy, they denied presence. The losses were acknowledged, but the catalyst was erased. This raised a question the appraiser could not ignore. If the child never existed in records, yet appeared repeatedly in images, then perhaps the photograph was not documenting family history at all. Perhaps it was documenting something else entirely, an intrusion that did not belong to lineage or blood. The boy's absence from paperwork began to feel less like an oversight and more like a condition. As though whatever he was could not persist outside the frame, could not be archived or named, could only be seen at the moment of capture. The deeper the appraiser dug, the more the records resisted coherence. Dates aligned too neatly. Gaps appeared where certainty should have been. It was as if history itself had been edited, not clumsily, but with precision, removing all traces except those that pointed indirectly toward consequence. The photograph remained untouched by this erasure, stubbornly preserving a presence the rest of the world refused to acknowledge, leaving behind the chilling implication that the child did not belong to the family, but to the moment itself, appearing only when the conditions were right, when a lens was opened and a future was about to fracture. What transformed unease into dread was the realization that the photograph was not fixed. At first, the appraiser blamed his own fatigue, the way long hours could trick the mind into finding patterns where none existed. He had stared at the image too long, zoomed too deeply, allowed imagination to bleed into observation. So he closed the file, stepped away, returned later with fresh eyes. That was when he noticed the change. The boy's expression was no longer exactly as it had been before. The shift was subtle, measured in fractions, but unmistakable once perceived. The curve of the mouth had tightened slightly, the corners lifted by a degree too small to quantify yet too precise to dismiss. Early photographs were immutable. Once fixed, they remained frozen forever, their chemistry indifferent to time and attention. Scratches could appear, tones could fade, but expressions did not evolve. And yet the boy's face now carried a faint suggestion of satisfaction, as though something had pleased him. The parents and daughter remained unchanged, locked in their original stillness, but the boy seemed to exist on a different plane of permanence. The appraiser saved a copy of the image, carefully labeling it with time and date, then reopened the original. The difference remained. Days passed, and the behavior continued. Each viewing revealed a minute alteration, always centered on the boy's face. Sometimes his eyes appeared slightly wider, as if sharpened by interest. Other times, the mouth relaxed, the knowing curve softening into something closer to anticipation. The changes never contradicted one another, they progressed, building upon what came before. It felt less like fluctuation and more like response. As though the photograph was aware of being observed and adjusted itself accordingly. The appraiser attempted to document the phenomenon scientifically. He captured screenshots at regular intervals, overlaying them, comparing pixel values. The software insisted the images were identical. No measurable data supported what his eyes clearly perceived. This contradiction only deepened the fear. If the changes could not be quantified, then they were not occurring within the photograph alone. They were occurring in the space between viewer and image, somewhere perception was being guided rather than deceived. Late one evening, after hours of cross-referencing and futile reassurance, the appraiser noticed something that broke his remaining sense of control. The boy's gaze was no longer fixed forward. It had shifted, just enough to suggest alignment with the position of the viewer. When the appraiser leaned slightly to the left, the gaze seemed to follow. When he straightened, it met him again head-on. This should have been impossible, photographs did not track movement. Yet the effect was undeniable, the sensation of being watched growing heavier with each second spent before the screen. It became clear that the boy's face was not changing randomly. It was reacting. Each viewing left a trace, each observer contributing something unseen that the image absorbed and reflected back. The more time spent studying the photograph, the more expressive the boy became. His features gained nuance, depth, and intent, while the rest of the image remained a relic of stillness. It was as if the photograph contained a single moving part, and that part was learning. The appraiser began to feel reluctant to look at the image, yet equally unable to stop. There was a pull to it, an unspoken invitation to witness the next change. And the changes grew bolder. The smile sharpened into something unmistakably pleased. The eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. The boy no longer looked like a subject caught in a moment, he looked like a participant engaged in an exchange. The act of viewing no longer felt passive. It felt reciprocal. One night, exhausted and unsettled, the appraiser left the image open on his monitor as he stepped away briefly. When he returned, the room felt altered, quieter, as though sound itself had been dampened. The photograph remained on screen, but the boy's face had shifted more dramatically than ever before. The smile was now fully formed, restrained but undeniable. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for confirmation and finally received it. The appraiser was seized by the certainty that the boy knew he had been left alone with the viewer's absence and had used that time to change. From that moment on, the photograph behaved differently with different people. When colleagues were invited to look, they described nothing unusual at first, only an odd sense of discomfort they could not articulate. But when they returned later, alone, they noticed subtle discrepancies from their initial viewing. The boy's expression never shifted in the same way twice. It adapted. Some viewers reported feeling mocked, others welcomed. A few refused to look again, unsettled by the sense that the image had seen too much. The appraiser began to understand that the boy's face was not merely changing over time, it was changing in relation to who was watching. The photograph was selective, responsive, discerning. It was not revealing a hidden truth all at once, but tailoring itself to each observer, drawing something out of them before deciding how to appear in return. This personalization made the experience deeply intimate and deeply violating, as though the image were reaching across time to study its audience. What frightened the appraiser most was the realization that the changes were cumulative. The boy did not reset between viewings. Each interaction added to him, layered new awareness onto the old. The expression carried echoes of previous watchers, traces of their reactions folded subtly into his own. He was becoming more defined, more present, while the boundary between photograph and reality thinned imperceptibly. Eventually, the appraiser noticed that the boy's gaze no longer stopped at the screen. It felt as though it extended beyond it, as if the image were no longer confined to the glass and pixels that held it. The photograph had begun as a static object, a document of a long-past moment. Now it behaved like an opening, a point of contact. The boy's face reflected not light, but attention itself, reshaping in response to every gaze, every hesitation, every unspoken fear, growing more certain with each viewer that noticed he was no longer content to remain exactly as he had been when the shutter first closed. The search for answers pushed the appraiser beyond the original photograph and into a far wider archive than he had ever intended to explore. At first, the idea seemed irrational, born from sleepless nights and creeping paranoia, but once it took hold it refused to let go. If the child did not belong to the family, then perhaps he belonged somewhere else. Or perhaps he did not belong at all. The only way to know was to look, not at records, not at names, but at faces. He began with regional collections from the same decade, focusing on studio portraits taken between 1895 and 1910. Families, school groups, church gatherings, formal commemorations, images that shared the same stiff composure and technical limitations. For days, nothing stood out. Then, in a photograph of a farming family from a neighboring county, he felt the same tightening in his chest. The image showed a mother, a father, 3 children. And there, second from the left, stood a boy whose face carried the same unsettling clarity. The same awareness. The same faint, controlled curve of the mouth. It was not resemblance in the ordinary sense. Hair color differed. Clothing was not the same. But the expression was unmistakable, as distinctive as a signature. The eyes held that same directness, that same sense of recognition. The boy's posture mirrored the original almost exactly, relaxed but deliberate, as though he knew precisely where to stand to be seen. When the appraiser overlaid the faces digitally, the alignment was impossible to ignore. Bone structure, spacing, proportions, identical beneath superficial differences. The shock of this discovery was quickly replaced by a deeper horror when the records were checked. This second family, too, had no documentation of the child's existence. Census forms listed fewer children than appeared in the photograph. Church records were silent. Personal letters referenced only the documented members of the household. And, as before, tragedy followed shortly after the photograph was taken. Illness. Disappearance. Financial collapse. The pattern repeated with chilling precision. Once the appraiser knew what to look for, he found the boy everywhere. In a class photograph from a small town school, standing at the edge of the group, his expression just slightly too composed. In a wedding portrait, positioned near the back, not formally part of the family but close enough to be included. In a memorial photograph taken after a factory accident, where he appeared among the survivors despite no survivor lists naming him. Each time, the same face looked back. Each time, the same absence in the records followed. What disturbed the appraiser most was that the boy never appeared twice within the same family lineage. He did not repeat himself in a way that could be explained by blood or heredity. He moved laterally, slipping between households, communities, even social classes. Wealthy families, impoverished ones, rural and urban alike, all were equally susceptible. The only constant was proximity to a photograph taken shortly before irreversible loss. As the collection of images grew, so did the realization that the boy's presence followed rules. He appeared only in photographs meant to preserve stability, family portraits, commemorations, moments of pride or permanence. He did not appear in candid street photography or chaotic scenes. He favored order, symmetry, intention. It was as though he required a certain stillness to enter the frame, a moment when people believed themselves safe enough to be remembered. The appraiser began to feel that the photographs were not merely capturing him, but inviting him. The act of posing, of arranging oneself carefully before a lens, created an opening. In that pause between motion and stillness, the boy slipped in. He did not disrupt the composition, he completed it. Looking at the images now, it was impossible to imagine them without him. He fit too well, as though the photograph had been waiting for his inclusion. The boy's expression varied slightly from image to image, but it never contradicted itself. In some, he appeared curious. In others, satisfied. In a few, almost tender. But always there was that sense of recognition, the feeling that he knew something about what was coming. The appraiser noticed that in photographs taken closest to disaster, the boy's face carried the faintest hint of anticipation, a tightening around the eyes that suggested certainty rather than surprise. As the appraiser compared timelines, a terrifying hypothesis emerged. The boy was not a witness to tragedy. He was a marker. His appearance did not follow loss, it preceded it. The photographs were not documenting families before they fell apart. They were documenting the moment something had already chosen them. The boy's presence was not an accident of history, but evidence of selection. The repetition across unrelated families destroyed any remaining hope of rational explanation. This was not a single haunting tied to one lineage or location. It was systematic. Intentional. The boy moved through time without aging, without changing in any meaningful way, attaching himself to moments of preservation as though drawn to the human desire to be remembered. Each photograph that captured him became a boundary marker, a line separating before from after. The appraiser began to dread the possibility that there were more images he had not yet seen. How many families had unknowingly preserved their own undoing on glass plates and paper? How many photographs hung quietly in homes or museums, their owners unaware of the extra present standing among them? The boy did not announce himself. He waited to be noticed. And once seen, he never truly left. The most chilling realization came when the appraiser noticed that in the earliest photographs, the boy appeared less defined. His expression was simpler, his gaze less assured. In later images, he was sharper, more confident, as though shaped by repetition. The more often he appeared, the more complete he became. It was as if each photograph contributed something to him, refining his presence across decades, allowing him to grow without aging, to learn without living. By the time the appraiser reached photographs from the late 1920s, the boy's face carried a depth that felt unbearable to look at. There was no innocence left in his eyes, only familiarity. He no longer looked like a child standing among families. He looked like something that understood families intimately, that knew exactly how and when they broke, and that had learned, over time, how best to place itself at the center of that breaking without ever appearing to be the cause. The final understanding did not arrive as a revelation, but as a surrender. After weeks of chasing evidence through archives, timelines, and faces that should not have existed, the appraiser stopped asking what the boy was and began asking what the photographs were doing. That shift changed everything. The images were not passive containers of history. They were active moments, thresholds created by human intention. Families did not simply have their portraits taken, they presented themselves to be fixed, to be preserved against uncertainty. In doing so, they offered something up, even if they did not know it. The appraiser realized that every photograph containing the boy shared a common condition: it was taken at a moment of confidence. Not happiness exactly, but certainty. These were families who believed in continuity, in the idea that what they were capturing would endure. The photograph was an act of faith, a declaration that this arrangement of people mattered enough to be held in time. That belief was the invitation. The boy did not force his way into the frame. He answered a call that had already been made. Once this idea took shape, the patterns aligned with terrifying clarity. The families were not random. They were not chosen for weakness or virtue. They were chosen because they stood at a point of balance, unaware that balance itself was fragile. The boy appeared at the precise moment permanence was claimed, as if to mark the instant before it failed. The portrait was not recording who they were. It was recording who they were about to lose. The appraiser came to understand that the boy was not bound to bloodlines or geography, but to intention. He belonged to the act of being seen and preserved. Where people gathered themselves into stillness and asked to be remembered, he could appear. The photograph was the mechanism, the tool through which he moved. It was not that the camera captured him, it was that the camera allowed him to choose. In the brief suspension between motion and memory, he stepped in. This explained why records could not hold him. He was never part of the family in the way records understood family. He did not eat at their tables or sleep under their roofs. He occupied the space between moments, attaching himself to the image that claimed to define them. His reality was not chronological. It was conditional. He existed only where the conditions of preservation were met. The tragedies that followed were not punishments, nor were they caused in any simple sense. The boy did not push events into motion. He did not poison, steal, or whisper disasters into being. His role was more subtle and far more disturbing. By choosing a family, by standing among them at the moment they attempted to fix themselves in time, he marked them as having already passed a point of change. The photograph became a seal, not of doom, but of inevitability. What followed would have happened regardless, but once the boy appeared, it could no longer be unseen or undone. The appraiser recognized that the boy's changing expression reflected this understanding. He was not growing in power, he was growing in familiarity. Each chosen family taught him more about the human need to be remembered, the fear beneath it, the quiet desperation that drove people to stand still and pretend stability could be captured. The more families he chose, the better he understood them. His awareness sharpened not because he fed on tragedy, but because tragedy revealed the truth of what had already been fragile. The photograph did not trap the families. It isolated them. By declaring themselves complete within the frame, they separated that moment from the rest of their lives. Everything that came after felt like a deviation, a fall from the image they had sanctified. The boy stood at that boundary, embodying the difference between what was preserved and what continued. He was the reminder that no moment survives intact, no matter how carefully it is framed. The appraiser finally understood why the boy reacted to viewers. Those who looked long enough were reenacting the same desire. To see clearly. To understand. To hold on to something before it slipped away. The boy responded because the act of looking completed the circuit. Viewer and subject became part of the same exchange, both reaching across time for certainty. The photograph chose families, yes, but it also chose witnesses. Each person who noticed the boy became part of the same process, briefly stepping into the role of one who wanted the image to mean something stable. This was why the boy never left one scene. Recognition was another form of preservation. To notice him was to invite him closer, to allow the boundary between image and observer to thin. The appraiser realized that the danger was not in the photograph itself, but in the human impulse to linger on it, to search it for answers. The boy did not chase. He waited. He always waited. In the end, the truth was unbearable in its simplicity. The portrait did not document families at all. It documented the moment they believed themselves whole. The boy appeared not to destroy that wholeness, but to witness its illusion. He chose families the way a shadow chooses a wall, appearing only where light insists on defining shape. The calm in the photograph was never real. It was a pause, and the boy stood within it, patient and exact, knowing that once the image existed, the future could no longer pretend it had not already begun to change. The appraiser sealed the final report and locked the photographs away, convincing himself that containment was the same as resolution. The archive returned to its controlled silence, shelves aligned, labels precise, history restored to order. For a time, it worked. The nights grew quieter. The sense of being watched faded into something he could name as memory rather than fear. He stopped opening the files. He stopped thinking about the boy. Then the museum announced a small exhibition. A modest thing, meant to celebrate early family photography. Nothing rare. Nothing dangerous. Just faces, dates, the comfort of knowing others had once stood still and been seen. The appraiser told himself it would be fine. After all, the original portrait was not included. He had made sure of that. On opening night, visitors moved slowly from frame to frame, murmuring about clothing and posture, about how serious everyone looked back then. Children tugged at their parents' hands, impatient to move on. Cameras flashed despite the signs. And somewhere between the second and third wall, the appraiser felt it again, that quiet tightening, the sensation of a room holding its breath. He approached one photograph he did not remember approving. It showed a family of 4. The composition was unremarkable. The lighting correct. The date card placed neatly below the frame. But there, standing just slightly off-center, was a boy whose face was too clear, too aware. His expression was calm, satisfied even, his eyes fixed not on the camera that had captured him, but on the space just beyond the glass. On the reflection, the appraiser saw himself. The boy's mouth curved, just enough to acknowledge recognition. By the end of the evening, no one could recall exactly when the photograph had been added to the exhibit. The catalogue listed it without comment. The records accepted it without resistance. And as visitors drifted home, carrying images in their minds of families long gone, the boy remained exactly where he was meant to be, standing patiently inside the moment they believed was safely preserved, waiting for the next person who would stop long enough to notice that the calm had never truly been empty at all.